Hey everybody, welcome to Ask the Pastor with J.D. Greer. I'm Matt Love, and I hope everybody enjoyed our series that we kind of did through the summer, going through some of the greatest hits and most popular episodes in Ask Me Anything and now Ask the Pastor. It was helpful, I think, to just revisit some important topics, just topics that it seemed like really resonated and were helpful in the moment and maybe could be helpful again. And so we are diving back into a new series now, though this fall we're going to spend some time in a special series called Gospel and Politics, which is obviously very timely because we're entering into this election season. If you haven't noticed, it is starting. I feel like now we're in that stretch where every third commercial is some sort of, political ad or whatever. And so we just felt like this was going to be a really timely series. And so this series features some conversations between Pastor J.D. and some incredible guests who are just really leading thinkers in different fields that we feel like are really kind of germane to this season and going to be really helpful for you guys. And so obviously I'm here without Pastor J.D. because this series is going to be Pastor J.D. talking to some of these leaders. And we'll be camping out in this series for a bit. I hope it's really valuable for you. As we're just all trying to kind of parse through the noise of the election season and figure out what it looks like to go through this season as believers. And so the first conversation and the first episode in this series is a conversation with Rebecca McLaughlin. She holds a PhD from Cambridge University and a theology degree from Oak Hill Seminary in London. She's also the author of several really, really good books, including Confronting Christianity, The Secular Creed, Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, and Does the Bible Affirm Same-Sex Relationships? So this is going to be a great first episode, and let's go ahead and get into it.
Hey, I want to welcome you to the Gospel and Politics series that we've been doing here at the Summit Church, where our mission is to create a movement of disciple-making disciples here in the Triangle and around the world. Our mission is not to be a political action committee. We are not even a political think tank, but we do want to just process what does our faith in Christ, what does a Christian worldview, what implications does it have for how we engage in politics? I don't remember who said it, but just what's the way to think Christianly about questions? Now, I just want to help your expectations here. This is not a place where we're endorsing candidates or even the finer points of particular policies, but just to say, how does having a Christian mindset, how does it shape? I think of the words of Abraham Kuyper that not one square inch of the entire cosmos there is that over which Jesus doesn't declare mine, which means he wants to be Lord of how we think about marginal taxation rates and how we approach, poverty and inequality and the protections of life and even things like marriage and stuff. So I am delighted. And that is not even like an overstated, just rhetorical word. I am absolutely delighted to have somebody who is no stranger to the Summit Church, and that is Rebecca McLaughlin, Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, I should say. She has been with us a number of times over the years, and recently she was here, and we had several enlightening conversations. It's just about culture and about what that means for the witness of the church, and we're going to have another one today. Rebecca holds a PhD from Cambridge University. She went to Cambridge because she wasn't able to get into Southeastern Seminary where I went, so her safety school was Cambridge over in England. She's also got a theology degree from Oak Hill Seminary in London. She's the author of some of my favorite books, some of the most helpful books I've read in the last several years. Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, a book that I've given out numerous times. My kids have given a copy of the teen version of that. I would suggest you do it to yours as well before they go to college, especially. She's written The Secular Creed, Engaging 5 Contemporary Claims, really built on the yard signs that your neighbors have in their yards about how nobody's illegal and love wins, and or I can't remember the one about love, but whatever, just the ones that tell us what our culture's values are, and really uses that as a starting point to engage about the gospel. Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, which is a wonderful devotional read that devotional and theological, just helping you see some things that you may not have seen before as you read the New Testament. And then a recent book, No Greater Love, a biblical vision for friendship, which strangely enough has a lot of implications, I think, for the political process, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. So, Rebecca, we are so grateful for you. There's 100 different things that you and I could talk about, but we're going to do our best to discipline ourselves so that we are talking about this that I think will be a helpful thing to our church. So welcome. Glad you're here.
Me too.
Yeah, well, let me just get right into it so we can make the most of our time here. First, you've written a lot about secularism, this secular age, and I'd just love for you to give a short definition of secularism and explain why that would be relevant for how we approach something like politics.
It's funny, when you first asked me that question, what comes to mind is the original origins of that word secular, which was a kind of Christian understanding of differentiating between some of the things that were under the purview of the sort of institutional church and the things that were under the purview of the world, which was sort of the secular sphere. But interestingly, that idea of there being a space that is under not under the purview of the church has kind of grown these additional legs in recent centuries to where many people in America today think that we live in a secular world and that there are certain basic assumptions that we can all share. We can sort of set religious belief aside and know from sort of firm secular foundations, by which people usually mean, broadly speaking, atheistic foundations, that there are certain things that are actually basic moral common sense. So, for example, the idea that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, the idea that men and women are equal, the idea that the strong and the rich and the powerful shouldn't trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, the idea that love across racial differences is good. All these things people imagine to be just like secular beliefs. And if anything, religious people and Christians are infringing on that strong kind of secular moral foundation when we come in with all the sort of crazy stuff that we believe, and there's certain places where Christian beliefs kind of come into conflict with some of what our neighbors who are not Christians would believe. So I think there's a strong sense that people have that we live in an increasingly secular age, especially in the West, and that we can forge a new kind of political future on the basis of these shared secular beliefs. But actually, even if you read what some of the leading kind of atheist and agnostic thinkers, historians, philosophers are saying today, what you'll find is, no, those beliefs are actually all specifically Christian beliefs. If you look at the history of thought, they came to us from Christianity. If you look at the foundations for them today, they remain Christian foundations. And when we take Christianity out from under the foundations of those seemingly secular beliefs, they actually fall apart in our hands.
I don't know if you were alluding to that or not, but Richard Dawkins from over in Great Britain has recently said just as much, hasn't he? And talked about how, while he still was not a believer in Jesus or even God, he thinks that this is absolutely essential for maintaining the coherence of Western civilization. Is that what you're referring to?
Not primarily. I think Richard Dawkins is making some small moves, though maybe not as big as some today would see. I'm thinking more actually of, a fellow Brit historian, Tom Holland, who wrote Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, where he is an agnostic, kind of discovered in the process of his research that actually his deepest moral beliefs were fundamentally Christian beliefs. And he's actually fascinating because he observes that when people debate some of our most politically charged questions today, so for example, questions of sexuality and gender, what he comments is that people on both sides of those questions, or all sides of those questions, are actually standing on Christian ground because they'll have shared beliefs like human equality. They'll have shared beliefs like the majority shouldn't be able to sort of oppress and trample on the minority, like men and women are equal. And as an ancient historian, he knows that these are not self-evident truths that have been believed by all people of all times at all. In fact, he would say they are as specifically Christian beliefs as like the belief that Jesus rose from the dead.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. I can't remember who it was. I don't think it was Richard Dawkins, but one of these guys said recently that he said, I am an atheist, but I am a Christian atheist, meaning that, he recognizes. Yeah,
I mean, the fact is that most, if you went and knocked on your neighbor's door and asked them what do they believe, whether they said that they were an atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, most likely the kind of full range, you would find they would hold these beliefs. But if you ask somebody like atheist historian Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote the best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, he points out that actually we can't get to these beliefs from an atheist position. For example, he says, Homo sapiens has no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. He says universal human rights is like a figment of our fertile imaginations. He quotes the US Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And he said, the Americans got the idea of human equality from Christianity. But if we stop believing in a God who made us and gave us souls and all that kind of jazz, then what does it even mean to say that human beings are equal?
Wow. Yeah. Well, in other words, it's almost what I hear you saying, just to connect the dot a little bit, is that it's kind of impossible for us to enter into the ballot box value-free, religion-free. That's not the same as trying to institute some kind of Christian state or anything like that, but just saying that these moral decisions that undergird laws are essentially, coming out of a worldview. And a lot of the new atheists, whether Richard Dawkins or, a Canadian, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, I know these guys are at different places in how they think about this stuff, but all of them are kind of saying atheism and secularism is not sufficient to be able to build that moral compass. It's got to come from somewhere, even if it's borrowed from somewhere else. And so, when you think about what a Christian should be bringing into the ballot box, talk to the person, whether they're, from the secular side or whether from the Christian side, about what's the difference in that and then unhelpfully wedding, church and state and how we think about politics.
Yeah, so one of the things that every Christian needs to bring into the ballot box is the deep call to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so we always need to be asking in any human interaction, what does love look like in this situation? And how that plays out in terms of sort of defining the laws of a country, which is obviously part of what we're trying to do when we're electing officials to represent us and to sort of forge the legal landscape, is figuring out what laws would be for the good of this country. And one of the interesting things that I think is important for Christians to note is that there are some things which Christians are absolutely commanded to do that really shouldn't be, and if we could wave a magic wand and make them the law of the land, we shouldn't do it. So, for example, I think you and I both believe pretty strongly that every Christian should be going to church every week. Every Christian should be praying and reading the Bible. Every Christian should be giving generously to the poor. Every Christian should be living a sexually faithful life, either as a faithful to one husband or one wife, or as a single person living without having sex with anybody. Now, all of these things are not just like optional extras for Christians. They're actually pretty vital for Christian discipleship. But my guess is that if you or I could wave a magic wand and make it the law of the land that next Sunday every person in America had to go to church, we actually wouldn't do it. Because we don't think this is something that sort of should be the law of the land. We think it's something that we'd love every person in America to be personally invited to church by a Christian, but not that they should be kind of legally forced to do that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, people sometimes say, well, you can't legislate morality. And so we shouldn't ever try to bring kind of Christian ethics and make it like a legislated thing. The reality is that we're always legislating morality one way or another, and that many of our laws are going to be resting on Christian foundations, springing out of some of the things I was talking about a few minutes ago. And so the question for a Christian is always going to be, okay, to what extent do I think that the law of the land needs to reflect my Christian beliefs? Like where is the dividing line? And there will be Christians who take different views on that. So, one example would be the question of same-sex marriage, where some Christians would say, I strongly believe that as a follower of Jesus, that I cannot and must not enter into same-sex sexual relationship of any kind. I strongly believe that is like against God's moral law for everyone. But just as I don't think it should be illegal, like somebody should be sort of sent to prison for committing adultery, for example, I also don't think that somebody shouldn't be allowed sort of legally to marry somebody of the same sex. Some Christians would take that view. Other Christians would say, no, I actually think that it should not be legal for two people of the same sex to get married in a sort of secular context.
It's sufficiently part of the backdrop. It's part of the natural law, and it's necessary for. So they would say that. But you're saying that's a question that Christians who agree on the substance of it could
legitimately disagree on. Just as there are other elements of that are pretty basic to the Christian life that we wouldn't want to be kind of enforced by law, if that makes sense. So I think there's room for disagreement in conscience and exactly how things play out. But in terms of principles, for example, every Christian, as they go to the ballot box, should be thinking, how am I going to act in a way that promotes care for the poor? You know, it's an unavoidable Christian ethic from the beginning to the end of the Bible, that every Christian must care for the poor. And Christians may take different views as to which particular sort of political or economic system is going to most result in care for the poor. Mm-hmm. But Christians don't have the option of saying, do you know what, I don't care about the poor. I want to focus on my own, accumulation of wealth. That's like not an option for Christians morally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the, kind of getting, if there's one kind of burden I feel like the witness of the church has to have is just real clarity around the things that are non-negotiable. Our protection of the vulnerable, our love of justice and righteousness, and the dignity of all people, and the care for the poor, and protection of things like whether it's the unborn or it's the immigrant. We're talking about those kinds of things, and then being able to stop at that place where we say, now that's the biblical mandate. Now I've got what I think are good reasons. Maybe you would even argue biblically applied wisdom to an area that I'm gonna say that's the wisest way I think to accomplish that. But I'm not going to make that a matter of biblical fidelity or faith or faithfulness. I'm gonna recognize that there's a restraint that I can just leave within the what the church is putting its authority behind. But let me take a slight step in a different direction, but that's related to this. And that is, as Christians find more and more of their culture secularized, and as we find, the Christian worldview push more and more to the margins, we've had the benefit, especially here in the United States, of it being a relatively Christianized culture where people at even the highest levels agreed on the basic tenets of the worldview. As we see that crumbling, we see ourselves pushed to the margins. I'd love to hear you just discuss just briefly what the implications of that are for the Christian's witness right now, and what that means for their engagement in the political process.
Yeah, great question. I think two things worth noting. One, biblical Christianity has been at odds with our culture in the US from the get-go, actually, if you think about it. Because whereas today we may find that biblical Christianity is at odds with broader culture on questions of sexuality and gender, for example, in ways that it hadn't been, 100 years ago. If we look back through history, we'll find that biblical Christianity was at odds with the way in which Black people were being treated, whether it was being enslaved or being, the segregation of schools. Like there are, people sometimes say to me, it must be hard raising Christian kids in Cambridge, Massachusetts today, where I live, in this sort of very kind of secular, hostile environment to their faith. And I would say, well, yes, it is, but dial back a few decades, and I would have been having to tell my Christian kids, because you're a follower of Jesus, you need to cross the segregation lines. So I think we can sometimes have this sort of sense that we're in a completely novel situation today where being a Christian is really putting you in a position where you're kind of in conflict with broader culture. I think there are different ways in which that's always been true, and that's okay. Like that's actually normative for Christians. If you think in terms of the early church, if you think of the church around the world today, we Christians shouldn't necessarily expect to be to fit in with the culture around us. In fact, if we listen to Jesus, we should expect more, that we would be opposed for following him. In terms of then how that plays out today, as we may feel increasingly like we're on the back foot culturally and being positioned not only in the margins culturally, but actually also even kind of as the bad guys culturally, which is often where certainly up here in the Northeast where Christians are often finding themselves. I think there are two opportunities there. One is to say, do you know what? Our message is not that we are good people, come and be like us. Our message is actually that we are sinful people who needed Jesus to come and die for us. And so feeling like we're kind of on the moral back foot, in and of itself may not be a bad entry point for sharing the gospel with somebody. And secondly, I think there is an extraordinary evangelistic opportunity that we have today, not least because the decline in church attendance over the last 25 years in America, which has been pretty dramatic, has come with a decline in mental health and happiness. especially among younger Americans, but not only. And there's a whole load of research coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health documenting the mental and physical health benefits of regular religious participation and quite how disastrous it has been for us culturally, just at a purely empirical, like data-driven level, the decline in church attendance. What that means today is that there is a whole generation of people who are desperately searching for meaning and purpose and love, who are desperately lonely, who have been told that they will find their meaning and sort of salvation in their own individual kind of unique self and in pursuing whatever sexual relationships they feel drawn to. And that generation, I'm meeting people continually who are finding that they have been utterly let down by that sort of worldview. And when they hear the gospel, when they have the opportunity to witness Christian community, when they're invited into that, they find Christianity incredibly attractive. So I think we actually have a huge evangelistic opportunity that we, if we're followers of Jesus, need to get out and make the most of.
What would you, finally, one last thing here. What would you say to the Christian who's just pretty fed up? They're exasperated with their options when they go to the political, the ballot box, when they feel like, you know what, maybe it's just better just to disengage and let's just build a great church and let's be a counter community within this and let's just keep our hands free of all that's going on out there because it's just hopeless. Both sides, one side leans toward one thing, and the other side, it just feel like I'm never going to be able to see, real progress in this. What word of counsel would you give to them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd first say I completely understand that feeling. And actually anybody who's looking at the political climate today and thinking, well, there's an obvious way for a Christian to vote isn't paying attention to the scriptures or to politics right now. But second, I would say, for all we might feel like we are kind of marginalized minority at the moment in the US, we're actually, if every Bible-believing Christian came together and we voted across the board in alignment with Christian values. So that means, as you mentioned earlier, it means everything from caring and protecting, caring for and protecting the unborn to caring for immigrants, to caring for single mothers, to upholding male-female marriage, like all across the board. We actually have incredible political power. So for every Christian to just sort of disengage and think, you know what, this is not, I'm not going to win this battle, so I'm not going to be in it, is actually missing an opportunity. But I think the important thing that Christians can do is not only vote, between the options that they have as best they feel in conscience that they can, but to, as far as they feel able, to sort of campaign across the board for Christian things, and that is not going to lead them to align completely with either of the major parties today. In fact, when I first moved to America, I'm from the UK, for those who haven't been paying attention.
That's not a
I moved to America in
accent,
2008.
in case you were wondering. Yeah.
So my first year in America was a presidential election, and I had this feeling of like, oh, this is very strange because the seeming values of these two parties at the time, the things that they seem to be for don't actually make a whole lot of sense together if you're not used to them being bundled together, if you're coming from the outside. And I'm like, I'm seeing sort of Christian values seemingly randomly allocated to the two different political parties I'm looking at here. How does that make any sense? And then I realized, it's actually because a lot of Americans are bringing some kind of Christian background to the ballot box. And so every party needs to appeal to some piece of that. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we got into a place where Christians were being sufficiently holistic in their understanding of Scripture that actually our politicians started to give us actually a holistically Christian option?
Yeah, and reminding ourselves that many of the things that we appreciate most in our country right now are the result of Christians getting involved, whether we're talking about freedom of speech and freedom of religion, or whether we're talking about a very small, unpopular minority that were advocating for the equality of the races, for Black people, white people, people of color, or whether we're talking about even certain women's things that have happened and a lot of the pro-life. These things are all the result of somebody saying, I care enough about my neighbor to actually get involved. And even if I feel like it's not changing the outcome of the election, it's it's a process. So good politics are a way of loving our neighbor. Rebecca, as always, delightful conversation. Thank you for just sharing your wisdom with us, and for the way that you are a light for the gospel and a light of wisdom. So grateful for you, and thanks for having this conversation with the Summit Church.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed this first episode of our Gospel and Politics series. Next week, we're going to be listening in on an interview between Pastor J.D. and Ed Stetzer. It's going to be an awesome episode. So go ahead and subscribe right now so you get that episode right on your phone, or you can subscribe on YouTube at j.d.greer, and you can watch these interviews on YouTube and just kind of get that vibe. I mean, the video vibe for some of these interviews is just great to see kind of how they're interacting. So go subscribe on wherever you get your podcast. Go subscribe on YouTube. We'll see you next time on Ask the Pastor.